When Moscow issues warnings about Iran, the language is always carefully chosen. This week, Russian officials suggested that any military action against Tehran would trigger consequences far beyond what American planners anticipate. The statement was not emotional. It was not theatrical. It was delivered through diplomatic channels with the precision of a technical briefing. And remarkably, almost no one in Washington seems to be asking the obvious question. Why would Russia risk escalation over a country that is neither a formal ally nor a treaty partner? The answer reveals something uncomfortable about how power actually works in 2025. If you have wondered why these warnings sound different from the usual diplomatic noise, stay with this analysis. We do not shout here, we test assumptions. If you want that approach, consider subscribing. The first thing that strikes any serious analyst is how American policy discussions treat Iran as an isolated problem. Congressional hearings focus on sanctions effectiveness. Pentagon briefings emphasize military options. Intelligence assessments detail Iranian capabilities. But there is a glaring gap in this entire framework. Almost no one discusses what happens when you attack a state that sits at the center of an emerging security architecture that includes Russia and China. This is not oversight. This is analytical blindness that could prove catastrophic. The problem is not bad information. The problem is treating partial information as complete strategy. Consider how these relationships actually function on the ground. Iran supplies Russia with military hardware for the Ukraine conflict. Russia provides Iran with advanced air defense systems and nuclear technology. China offers Iran economic corridors and energy partnerships that bypass Western sanctions. This is not ideology. This is mutual dependence. When you strike one note in this network, you do not just hit Iran. You stress the entire system, and stress systems react unpredictably. But we are only beginning to understand the scope of what Washington might be triggering. Think through the operational realities that Pentagon planners face if they move against Iranian nuclear facilities. The mission requires sustained air operations over several days. It demands suppression of Iranian air defenses across multiple provinces. It needs intelligence networks that can verify target destruction in real time. All of this assumes Iran responds alone. But what if Russia decides that protecting its strategic partners serves Russian interests more than avoiding confrontation with the United States? Suddenly, your limited operation becomes something much larger. Russian military advisors are already embedded within Iranian defense structures. Russian radar systems monitor the Persian Gulf. Russian technicians maintain equipment that would be central to any Iranian response. Strike Iran. And you are not just attacking Iranian assets. You are attacking a system that includes Russian personnel, Russian technology, and Russian strategic interests. This is where the comfortable assumptions fall apart. The more you examine Russian warnings, the clearer it becomes that Moscow sees Iranian security as inseparable from Russian security. This is not emotional solidarity. This is strategic calculation. Iran provides Russia with a southern corridor that bypasses European sanctions. Iran offers Russia leverage against American naval dominance in the Middle East. Iran gives Russia a pressure point against Israeli operations that complicate Russian activities in Syria. Lose Iran, and Russia loses critical strategic depth at a moment when it cannot afford further isolation. From Moscow's perspective, allowing America to neutralize Iran is equivalent to allowing America to weaken Russia by proxy. This is why Russian warnings carry unusual specificity. They are not bluffing. They are signaling that an attack on Iran crosses a threshold that Russia cannot ignore without undermining its own strategic position. The question that should worry American decision makers is simple. If Russia views Iranian security as essential to Russian security, what exactly does Russian retaliation look like? Military escalation is one possibility, but Russian options extend far beyond kinetic response. Russia could accelerate weapons transfers to Iran. Russia could provide real-time intelligence during any American operation. Russia could open new pressure points against American allies elsewhere. The assumption that you can hit Iran and contain the consequences to the Middle East may prove to be the most dangerous miscalculation since the invasion of Iraq. If this analysis unsettles you, then you understand why these warnings matter more than most analysts admit. Consider the naval dimension that rarely enters American planning discussions. The Persian Gulf is a narrow waterway where Iranian anti-ship missiles backed by Russian targeting systems could disrupt global energy flows within hours. American carrier groups provide impressive firepower but they also present concentrated targets in confined waters. If Russia provides Iran with real-time satellite intelligence and advanced missile guidance, even limited Iranian retaliation could force American naval assets to withdraw from the Gulf entirely. Energy prices spike globally. European allies face immediate economic pressure. Chinese energy imports face disruption. What begins as a bilateral American-Iranian confrontation rapidly becomes a global crisis that benefits no one except those who profit from chaos. But the naval challenge is only one layer of a much more complex problem. The nuclear dimension demands even more careful analysis. Iran is approximately 18 months away from weapons-grade uranium production. American military action might delay this timeline, but it cannot eliminate Iranian nuclear knowledge or infrastructure entirely. More critically, an attack that fails to completely neutralize Iranian capabilities gives Tehran justification to withdraw from all international monitoring and accelerate weaponization. Russia, having warned about consequences, would face pressure to provide Iran with more advanced nuclear assistance to demonstrate the credibility of Russian commitments. The result could be an Iran with nuclear weapons sooner rather than later, backed by Russian technical support and Chinese economic protection. American officials who believe they can bomb Iran back to nuclear zero fundamentally misunderstand how proliferation works in an era of great power competition. Let me ask you directly, do you believe American intelligence agencies have accurate, real-time information about Russian-Iranian military cooperation? Do you think Pentagon planners fully understand the integration between Russian air defense systems and Iranian strategic assets? Have you seen evidence that American decision-makers comprehend how quickly regional conflict can become global crisis when major powers decide their core interests are threatened? If your answer to any of these questions is uncertain, then you understand why Russian warnings deserve more attention than they currently receive. The economic warfare dimension reveals additional complications that American policymakers rarely discuss publicly. Iran sits at the center of alternative payment systems designed to bypass dollar dominance. Russian energy exports increasingly flow through Iranian financial networks. Chinese trade with both countries operates through mechanisms that deliberately avoid Western oversight. Strike Iran, and you accelerate the development of parallel economic systems that reduce American financial leverage globally. The short-term military satisfaction of neutralizing Iranian nuclear facilities could accelerate the long-term decline of American economic influence. This is not about supporting or opposing any particular policy. This is about understanding the second and third order consequences of military action in an interconnected world. Russian warnings also reflect a deeper strategic reality that American analysts often ignore. Moscow cannot afford to appear weak when partners face existential threats. If Russia fails to protect Iran after issuing explicit warnings, then other Russian partners, particularly China, will conclude that Russian security guarantees are worthless. This would fundamentally undermine Russian strategic credibility at a moment when Russia needs maximum leverage in negotiations over Ukraine sanctions relief and European security architecture. From Moscow's perspective, allowing America to attack Iran without significant response would signal Russian decline more clearly than any military defeat. Understanding this dynamic is crucial for assessing how far Russia might be willing to escalate in defense of Iranian interests. If you are still with this analysis, then you recognize that military action always has political consequences that extend far beyond immediate battlefield results. The Israel factor adds another layer of complexity that American planners cannot ignore. Israeli operations against Iranian nuclear facilities would likely require American logistical support, intelligence sharing, and post-conflict protection. But Israeli action that triggers Russian retaliation places American allies in an impossible position. European NATO members would face pressure to support the United States while simultaneously managing energy crises caused by disrupted Middle Eastern supply chains. Turkish control of Bosphorus shipping lanes becomes critical if Russian naval assets need to reinforce positions in the eastern Mediterranean. Even successful military action against Iran could fracture Western alliance structures if the consequences prove more severe than anticipated. The assumption that you can isolate Iranian nuclear threats from broader geopolitical competition ignores how modern conflict actually works. Chinese calculations introduce yet another variable that American decision-makers seem reluctant to address. Beijing has invested heavily in Iranian energy infrastructure through Belt and Road initiatives. Chinese companies operate significant assets in Iranian oil and gas sectors. Chinese financial institutions provide Iran with alternative funding mechanisms that reduce dependence on Western systems. Military action against Iran threatens Chinese economic interests while simultaneously demonstrating American willingness to use force against Chinese strategic partners. Beijing might not intervene militarily, but Chinese economic and technological support for Iranian recovery efforts could prove more consequential than direct military assistance. The question is whether American strategists understand how to manage simultaneous confrontations with Russia, China, and Iran without triggering broader systemic collapse. Consider the intelligence challenge that American planners rarely acknowledge publicly. Effective strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities require precise, real-time information about hardened targets, underground installations, and mobile assets. But intelligence networks that took years to develop could be compromised within hours if Russian electronic warfare capabilities disrupt American surveillance systems. Iranian deception operations backed by Russian technical expertise could present false targets while protecting actual capabilities. The assumption that American intelligence dominance ensures mission success ignores the reality that information warfare favors defenders who control local terrain and possess external technical support. Military action based on incomplete or manipulated intelligence has not ended well for American forces in recent decades. The timeline dimension reveals perhaps the most critical flaw in current American thinking. Pentagon planners design operations assuming they can control escalation ladders and manage conflict duration. But Russian warnings suggest that any attack on Iran would trigger immediate rather than graduated response. Russian military assets could be repositioned within hours. Iranian proxies across the region could activate simultaneously. Chinese economic countermeasures could begin before American aircraft return to base. The comfortable assumption that America can strike first and then manage the consequences through diplomacy misunderstands how modern conflict escalates in an interconnected world. Your operational timeline becomes irrelevant when multiple actors respond simultaneously across different domains. Close your laptop, put down your phone, stop reading headlines for 10 minutes. Ask yourself one serious question. Do you believe American decision makers fully understand what they would be triggering if they attack Iran, while Russia, China, and Iran have spent years building integrated defense cooperation? If your answer is anything less than confident, then you understand why Russian warnings matter more than most Washington analysts want to admit. The reality is not complicated, but it requires patience to understand properly. Military action against Iran in 2025 is not the same as military action against Iran in 2005. The strategic context has changed. The alliance structures have evolved. The consequences extend far beyond the Middle East. Russian warnings reflect this new reality. American planning appears to ignore it. This video is for educational and motivational purposes. If you are struggling, consider speaking with a qualified professional.